So Lumix have given us a firmware update to the S5 IIX, the S5 II, the GH7, and also the G9 Mark II. There's a lot we've got to be talking about when it comes to that crop zoom and obviously the autofocus options that they gave. And you'll be able to use the Lumix Lab app with the S5 IIX now, which is pretty incredible. And I do want to test the latency to see if it's actually better than using the HDMI. So let's get it. So if you haven't done any firmware updates with any camera manufacturer before, it's a very simple process. All you need to do is go to the Panasonic website or your camera manufacturer's website, download that firmware, and make sure you put it directly onto the front page of the SD card. So put it back into your camera, go down to the firmware option, and then you just need to select yes or proceed, update that firmware, let it go through its process. So make sure you don't turn it off, make sure you try not to interrupt that, and also make sure you have a full battery as well. Now, once you've done that, we'll talk about the first firmware update, and that comes down to the autofocus. So this one gives you a whole bunch of different options with human, animal, car, motorcycle, train, and airplanes. But the most interesting thing about the autofocus is that you can actually focus on a particular part of that object. So obviously the human will be the eye or face first, and then if it can't sort of see the eye or face, it will just go for the whole body. Similar thing with like your animal, it will try and go for the eye or face, but if it can't sort of detect that or it's tilted on the side, it will just go for the whole body. Now the interesting thing with a motorcycle, it'll try and go for the head or helmet, but then if it can't see or detect the head or helmet properly, it'll just detect the whole motorcycle. Similar thing with the car. If it's on the side, it will do the whole car, but if it's on the front, it'll only focus directly on the front, which is the main focal point. Similar thing with planes and the train as well. So, and that's just interesting because this is a firmware update. The hardware was obviously already in there to be able to focus on these particular things. So they've really squeezed it out of the processor and given us some better autofocus options in the Lumix cameras. But the one interesting thing is, how good is this autofocus? Like, is it actually practical or is it a little bit of a gimmick? This actually works really well, as you can see on the train. It looks right at the glass of the cabin, and then when it can't find that glass, it pretty much hits the front of the cabin, which is pretty impressive. Then the next train comes past and it does the exact same with that. I am so impressed. Even with this car, you can see it focuses on the front of the car, and then when it doesn't see the front of the car, it focuses on the whole part of the car. Like, Sony actually had to introduce a whole AI processor to get something that's just like this. And even though it's early stages of me testing this, I'm pretty impressed with the way it works. Now the next one is interesting, and it's called hybrid zoom or crop zoom. So essentially hybrid zoom is almost like Sony's clear image zoom. So it uses the processor to crop in camera, mainly for the fact that it's a 6K sensor that downsamples to the 4K. So you have extra resolution that it can sort of, pull from and be able to give you still, a 4K export. But obviously in saying that, you can't use the 6K OpenGate with this because it's 6K, so you have to use either Cinema 4K or just standard UHD 4K, and that will give you the 1.5 times crop. Now the hybrid zoom crop, essentially you can use those with the zoom lenses, but if you do have the prime lens, this is where you have to go for a crop zoom mode, which gives you that 1.5 times crop. But the most interesting thing is that this is very similar to the technology that's in the Sony cameras, the clear image zoom. And I've done so many tests on the clear image zoom, and at the end of the day, it doesn't really make too much of a difference. You could pretty much do the exact same thing in post-production, and that's pretty much what I do now. I don't use clear image zoom anymore. All I do is I'll literally walk in closer. That is the best thing you could do, or zoom in closer. Or if you can't zoom or walk in closer, I'll just crop in post, because I am filming at the highest resolution 4K and it's given me a really good image. Now I did go through the liberty of doing a side-by-side with 6K OpenGate, regular Cinema 4K, and then regular Cinema 4K with the crop zoom, but then also the newest mode, MP4 Lite. And at the end of the day, it's very similar. If you crop in camera or if you crop in post, it doesn't seem to make too much of a difference. Sure, the noise pattern is just a little bit better if you do actually crop in post as opposed to cropping internally. But obviously the 6K OpenGate is better than the Cinema 4K or the Cinema 4K with the crop zoom. And look, even on my screens, I'm finding it hard to see the differences between the four. And these are really high resolution screens. So this is going to be compressed through YouTube. So you're probably going to find it even more difficult to see the difference. But realistically, at the end of the day, the higher codecs will just give you a little bit more flexibility in post-production and just allows you to play with the footage a little bit more. The compressed footage obviously has less flexibility. So if you do want the best of the best of the best, that's when you go the better codecs. But at the end of the day, a lot of the times, people aren't even going to notice. Just do what is best for your workflow. And if we are to talk about the noise pattern, they're very similar across the board, except for the MP4 Lite. This is where you could see the macro blocking, and it looks like it's doing a bit too much when it comes to the noise reduction. And it looks a little bit too smooth, but don't get me wrong, this is at 200% zoom, so this is actually pixel peeping, and if you do look at it 1:1, you probably won't notice any difference. Specifically, if you are utilizing this for social media, you know, Instagram or TikTok, you probably won't notice any difference whatsoever. And the biggest pro about the MP4 Lite is that it's 50 megabits per second. It's crazy when it comes to that file size in comparison to the 6K OpenGate. But yeah, sure, it's a UHD 4K, but still you get UHD 4K with the 3x2 OpenGate mode. So you can actually start using, you know, anamorphic lenses, or if you just want that extra 3x2 mode for, you know, vertical cropping, perfectly fine. So if I am to compare the 3x2 6K OpenGate to the new MP4 Lite's 3x2 UHD OpenGate, I mean, look, side by side, you can't really tell much of a difference, but the noise pattern definitely is different. Like there's a lot of compression issues when it comes to this MP4 Lite, but it's expected. It's 50 megabits per second. It's crazy small, which is incredible and really great for social media content, even just YouTube content. Like you still wouldn't know. Like it's 10-bit 420. It's still great codec, but at the end of the day, you're going to get more flexibility and just more resolution of that 6K OpenGate. And talking about vertical cropping, we have to talk about frame marker, which is a new feature as well. So essentially we can do, you know, your 9x16 frame marker inside. We can move that frame from right to left, but we can also change the size of that 9x16 frame. Now you don't just get access to 9x16, you can do 2.39:1, you know, your CinemaScope timeline. You can do 1.85:1, 3x2, 2x3, 3x4. There's so many different aspect ratios that you can put in there, but you can also choose multiple aspect ratios on the screen at once and move them around the frame. So it's pretty interesting. Just gives you a little bit more sort of to play with when it comes to trying to frame it up, because, you know, social media is absolutely massive these days. We don't just have to do a 16:9 sort of output. We have to think about, you know, your 9:16, because a lot of companies are wanting both formats for, you know, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and even website marketing. Now, the last significant one is the Lumix Lab app. Now, this is a really interesting app and it works incredibly well. In terms of the latency, it's pretty much on point. There is a little bit of latency, and I did take the liberty of trying to see what it would look like in comparison to my Atomos Ninja 5 and see what the three footages look like. So you've got the screen on the back, you've got the Lumix Lab app on my phone, but then you've also got the Ninja 5 that's attached through to the HDMI, and it does seem like it's a little bit faster when it comes to you know, the HDMI output, but it's still not the exact same pace as what you see on the screen. So you can see the timer there, but then also my hand going in and out, like it's a microsecond, you know, faster than the HDMI. So I was thinking, okay, maybe this is going to fix that sort of HDMI latency issue, but no, there still is a little bit of latency. It is a little bit better than the HDMI, but I won't be using it as an external monitor. But you do have touch to focus, which is really cool, and you can access all your main features, all your main settings in your Lumix camera and adjust it through that, which is pretty handy to have, especially if you are monitoring in front of the camera, you're filming yourself and you don't have a video transmitter. So look, overall, Lumix have done an incredible job to really squeeze out the processor and trying to give us a whole bunch more features in these cameras and make them very similar across the board. So it is impressive and they're doing great things. But, you know, Lumix don't exactly have too much to offer when it comes to, you know, Canon, Sony and Nikon, because they have a lot of different cameras in their system. And I guess in a way, Canon, Sony, Nikon don't really have to give us firmware updates because all they do is just give us brand new cameras anyway, which kind of sucks. Like Lumix are really supporting their fan base by giving these kind of firmware updates and keeping them up to date, which, you know, is really great. So anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one. Let's get it.